Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, we're here this week with Professor Andrew Leach from the University of Alberta. I figured that for our kind of year-ender, kind of a big underlying theme about a lot of stories we talked about this year have really had their roots in federalism, whether that was everyone passing the buck on the occupation in Ottawa, what's going on in healthcare right now, and we've got a Supreme Court challenge coming up in March around the Impact Assessment Act. So Andrew's been studying this stuff, and I figured we'd just have a chat about kind of where we're seeing the playing field right now. Andrew,
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be back.
um, I guess, why don't we just start with the environment because that's kind of been where your niche has been lately. Where are you seeing kind of the federal provincial tensions on that file?
Yeah, I think you've got a couple of different places where it's going to come up over the next little while. The one you mentioned already, the Supreme Court reference on the Impact Assessment Act and this question of how far can the federal government go to protect the environment or to judge the impacts of major projects. There's some of them that it's clear, but I think uh, the reach that the federal government's looking for in this particular piece of legislation is quite broad, and the previous versions of it hasn't been tested since the original Old Man River case. So it's legislation that's evolved a lot. It's a federal role. It's evolved a lot. So I think that's going to be one of the playgrounds. The second one would be the oil and gas, or the regulatory cap on oil and gas, which
Mhm.
Premier Daniel Smith has already identified as a big source of tension. Plastics less so, but then the one I think maybe is a sleeper right now is the carbon pricing, in the sense that we started out with the system that has rules for two different types of provincial policies: cap and trade and carbon pricing.
Right.
And initially, it was, the cap and trade was the stringent one, and we were trying to pull the non-BC provinces up to a level of stringency on their carbon pricing or price-based approaches. Now that's flipped, and you have carbon prices that are 40% higher in Alberta than they are in Quebec, and that presents a very interesting conundrum for the Prime Minister. It's not us out here on the prairies with our low carbon pricing. It's,
Mhm.
if you did the same thing in Quebec as you do in Edmonton, at a refinery, in your car, et cetera, the carbon price that you're paying is lower in Quebec than it is here. And I think that is maybe not the challenge that people might have expected to the carbon pricing and the new benchmark that they have. So those are my big ones for now on the energy
Mhm.
file.
When it comes to that cap and trade system, is that just a function of the market in that right now that's where the market is sitting at for those permits, and I'm guessing it's likely to increase over the next cycle, or what are we?
Not necessarily. I think it will go up over time, but I think it's more the fact that the federal carbon pricing benchmark is accelerating quite rapidly. So, when you think of the progression of $15 a year, right now going from 50 to 65, that's a big level increase. And so the stringency on the Quebec California cap and trade is not expected, I don't think, to keep up with that. So there the
Okay.
question will be for the federal government: where do they come in and say, we need a top up, we need an added price, we need, I think Trevor Toombs talked about a transactions levy or a transactions adder or something, but something that makes that price more real in Quebec than it is right now.
Okay. One of the other things we're seeing as well is the Sovereignty Act in Alberta and the Saskatchewan First Act, um, both of which have come under major criticism from First Nations groups in both provinces. But when it comes to, again, this tension in federalism, I mean, they're supposed to be attempts at pushing back against what they see as federal intrusion. I think your mileage may vary on who's doing the actual intrusion there, but where do we see either of those particular issues going?
That's a good question. I mean, I think the two bills have the same sort of genesis point, but they've had very different trajectories. Alberta's ran through the legislature very quickly, all the way to approval. Saskatchewan's isn't yet enacted, so far as I know, unless that's changed.
Not so
Um,
far as I know.
yeah, and Alberta's had very strong, partisan line opposition differences, whereas Saskatchewan's, at least on the last vote that I saw, was a unanimous approval. So the NDP seemingly got maybe boxed into a corner to support it. And then Saskatchewan's legislation actually contains a proposed amendment to the Constitution along the lines of Quebec's bills from earlier in the year.
Yeah.
And so, whereas Alberta's really doesn't, it says, we're going to do stuff within our existing powers to frustrate Ottawa in some undefined way. So, to lump them together, I think they're two very different pieces of legislation with some similar rhetoric around them. So they tend to get grouped, but Alberta's will be. We saw the Onion Lake Cree Nation challenge yesterday. I
Yeah.
think it'll be interesting, in part because that challenge appears to address the bill as it was introduced, not the bill as passed. And then it's not really clear that the bill does, at least to me, what the challenge kind of associates it with doing. And so we'll see how that plays out. And we'll see what
Okay.
role Ottawa takes in it.
No, for sure. And I think Ottawa has thus far, with those particular pieces of legislation, tried not to get in, or tried not to give those premiers the fight that they're looking for.
Yeah.
But that could have to change. I'm guessing if more Indigenous groups want to stand on it.
Yeah, I think from the Alberta one, which is more in my wheelhouse, it depends on what the province actually does under the act. I think if you have, and we saw actions they've taken outside of the act. So Minister Shandro directing, or not explicitly directing, advising Crown prosecutors to devote resources elsewhere, I think is the appropriate term.
Mhm.
That's not under the Sovereignty Act, but that's still maybe something, if the firearms legislation eventually makes its way through Parliament, maybe something that Ottawa needs to address in terms of its own enforcement decisions. And then beyond that, I think the challenges, as they come to Alberta's legislation, can come with or without Ottawa support.
Okay. Um, I'm guessing with some of the other files, whether it's healthcare or whether it's this trying to clarify police of jurisdiction and so on. Where do you see any potential for legal action or lawsuits in any of these in order to try and get some clarity or to try and push a government into acting one way or another?
I mean, in healthcare, what's interesting to me is more the mismatch in rhetoric, especially from the Western premiers. And again, sitting in Western Canada, where you have the premiers really looking for the federal government to do less tax and transfer, a lot of rhetoric against dollars being collected in federal taxes in Western Canada and dispersed nationally. But then you come to the healthcare file where all of a sudden that's what we're asking them to do, which
Yeah.
to me seems strange. And this question of the very strong, so almost call them provincialist premiers, studiously avoiding the fact that they have the power to tax and that they administer the healthcare system,
Yeah.
right? And so it's almost set up, I think, as a win-win for Danielle Smith and Scott Moe essentially right now, where they've created the debate and almost managed the media conversation so that the media is saying, well, when is Justin Trudeau going to give the provinces the money they need to get over this healthcare crisis? And even if the federal government does reach this agreement, then you'll hear the other shoe will drop, and it'll be, oh, yet another system where Alberta's paying more than it's getting back from Ottawa, et cetera, et cetera. And
Yeah.
so, it's been interesting for me to see how that's been allowed to walk that way, and nobody asking the premiers almost directly, well, don't, there's only one taxpayer.
Yeah.
if you think your particular system needs more resources, bring them on.
Yeah.
You don't
Um,
need the federal government to walk away from tax points or whatever the, you know, language of the day is.
yeah.
There's no collar on the provincial government to raise more money or to borrow money, either or.
Yeah, it's one of those things where the premiers who are running surpluses and handing out checks to people at the same time as crying poor, it's like, we can see you doing that.
Yeah, but even with it, even the ones that weren't running a surplus or that aren't
Yeah,
running a surplus, same thing applies, right? Either you're calling on the federal government to cancel some other program in order to devote more dollars to healthcare, or you're calling on them to raise more tax dollars to devote more dollars to healthcare. And if you're calling on them to raise more tax dollars, then you might as well do it yourself.
yeah, but then, then they get the unpopularity of being the government that raised the taxes, and they don't want to do that.
Sure. And this is
So,
back to, how this is set up or being allowed to be set up as a win-win for Premier Smith and Moe, where, either they're going to be able to blame Trudeau for one of many things or many of many things, no
yeah.
matter how this plays out.
All right. Um, Anything, yeah, I guess you're looking at in terms of your research, as to what you're looking to happen in the next year or so, I guess, on this dynamic.
Well, I think you circle back to the Supreme Court reference. I think that one's been one that has not been on a lot of people's radar the same way as the carbon tax reference was. There's not a lot of political rhetoric associated with it outside of Alberta, but unless something's changed in the last couple of days, every province is intervening against Ottawa's position on that legislation. So that's far more unanimity than there was, for example, on the carbon pricing reference, where provinces like BC were on side and really pushed the issue probably stronger even than the federal government did. Now
Yeah,
you've got the federal government going to court not only against Alberta and the Jason Kenney, Danielle Smith government, it's all of the provinces saying you're over the line here. And so I think that one's going to be one that sneaks up on a lot of people. And regardless of how that goes, again, you have some pretty big federal policies coming in behind it that are starting to get sort of meat put on the bones, so to speak. The clean electricity regulation and the oil and gas cap that are really the federal government coming deep into legacy provincial jurisdiction. And, legacy provincial jurisdiction with effects that differ a lot across provinces. So the clean electricity or the oil and gas cap, those are affecting 5 or 6 provinces at most in very important ways, and certain other provinces almost not at all.
right.
And so I think that's the other dynamic that comes in. The Impact Assessment Act, everyone seems to want to push back on it in parts. But on the oil and gas and clean electricity, you're going to have some provinces saying, basically saying, sure, no problem, we could do it tomorrow. And other provinces, my own included, for which, speaking of this today on the coldest day of the year, when we're, on a pretty tight electricity market day here in Alberta,
Mhm.
this is a real issue as to how you manage that transition that the federal government's pushing on it, load the oil and gas cap on top of it, and then load an impact assessment act that makes a lot of these projects harder to change, deliver, build, et cetera, then it's a real question of how all of that plays out politically here, politically in Ottawa, and then of course in the courts.
All right. Great. Well, thanks for taking the time to do this, and we'll do it again.
Oh, thanks. That was a lot of fun.
All right. Cheers.
Okay.
And that's everything for this week and for this year. I'm taking the next couple of weeks off, but join us again in the new year for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.